Hey everyone, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone. If you can we can get started if you want to come in, find a seat. There's plenty of room here up front. Thank you all very much for being here for this very special event hosted by the Division of Pediatric Endocrinology. Today is the annual Walter Miller Lecture. The Miller Lecture is sponsored in part by an unrestricted educational grant from Corcept Therapeutics, so we're very grateful for their support. And it is my honor today to introduce the speaker for today's Walter Miller Lecture. As I was preparing this introduction to talk about Dr. Miller and Dr. Lazar, I realized that I could probably spend the entire hour talking just about their accomplishments, but I know it's not me that you want to hear from, so I'll keep it very brief. But this lectureship honors our very own distinguished professor, Dr. Walter Miller, a legend in the field of pediatric endocrinology. His pioneering work in human steroid biosynthesis and disorders of steroid metabolism, as well as his years of mentorship of physician scientists, has left a profound legacy at UCSF and the field of endocrinology. This year, we're privileged to host Dr. Mitchell Lazar, Willard and Rhoda Ware Professor of Diabetes and Metabolic Diseases, Director of the Penn Diabetes Research Center, and the founding director of the Institute of Diabetes, Obesity and Metabolism at the University of Pennsylvania. His leadership and foundational research on metabolism and circadian rhythms has earned him the field's highest honors, including the 2023 Koch Lifetime Achievement Medal from the Endocrine Society and the 2025 Colbert Medal from the Association of American Physicians. Dr. Lazar is also one of the few physician scientists elected to all three National Academies, Medicine, Arts, and Sciences, a reflection of his incredible impact. Today, he will discuss the current challenges to scientific integrity and how we can restore confidence in medical research. I'd also like to highlight that Dr. Lazar has kindly agreed to give us another talk tomorrow, which will be held in the Diabetes Center at Parnassus. It will be on nuclear receptor regulation of circadian rhythms and metabolism. It is in the Health Sciences West building in room number 302, and there is also a Zoom link. So if you don't have that information, need that information, you can definitely reach out to me or one of the other organizers here, and we'll provide you with that information. So thank you again. And now we'd like to present a plaque to Dr. Lazar, honoring him as the Walt Miller, for the Walt Miller Lectureship, presented by our division chief, Dr. Maya Lotish.
Thank you so much. This honors you for awarded for the Walter Miller Distinguished Lectureship with our appreciation.
Thank you. No AV? All right, I'll try to do this without the, I think I can do it, it's fine. It's in presenter mode, it's not my normal style.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
yes.
Perfect.
It'll just
Okay, thank you.
And there's a pointer there.
I'm going to just use my. Thank you, Shai and Maya. It's really a great honor for me to be here to deliver a lecture named after Walter Miller. I consider Walter to have been one of the earliest adopters of what became known as molecular endocrinology, which really has its roots here at UCSF. I've known Walter for many years, mainly from the Endocrine Society and, of course, reading his publications. I'm a great admirer of his work on cloning peptide hormones and especially the work on synthetic steroid synthetic biosynthetic enzymes that we just heard about, which had a huge impact on the field of endocrinology. I'm also proud that he and I are both graduates of MIT, along with Robert Lustig, who's here, and Rich Alkus, who delivered the 2024 Walter Miller Lecture. So the four of us nerds have celebrated this fact many times at the Endocrine Society. Grand rounds. Let's see. What I have. Can I have that same person up here? I don't think this is good. So I can just hit a button and move the slides. Say right here. Oh, okay. Okay, that was supposed to be up there. What I was talking about. Grand round lectures typically begin with an informative case of a patient whose story introduces and epitomizes the medical problem that's the subject of the entire lecture. In that spirit, I'll start with a case here. That case is me. After completing my clinical training in endocrinology, I became interested in how thyroid hormone exerted its pleiotropic effects on the body, including its profound effects on energy consumption. These studies on the right were performed the year before the discovery of insulin. They already knew that thyroid hormone lowered or increased basal metabolic rate and was a treatment of obesity. But the molecular mechanism of thyroid hormone action remained elusive for over half a century. By the time I got interested in this question, it was the golden era of molecular endocrinology, and I joined the lab of Bill Chin at Harvard Medical School to investigate the mechanism of thyroid hormone action. There was mounting evidence that the hormone worked by binding to nuclear receptors in chromatin, and one of the leading proponents of this was John Baxter, the late John Baxter here at UCSF, and one of Walter's mentors. This was a very exciting time when protein encoding genes were just being identified and characterized, and I decided to clone the receptor for thyroid hormone. The process was painstakingly slow, as many of the gray-haired people here remember, and it was prone to frustration as the techniques for DNA sequencing were primitive in comparison with today's next-generation sequencing tools. Today, you can get millions of base pair sequence readings in a day, but in those days, I marched through the sequence 100 base pairs at a time every few days in an arduous process. As the sequences unfolded, I was thrilled to recognize that I had found two thyroid receptor subtypes, which are shown here as TR beta 2 and TR alpha 2 on this slide, which shows you all the thyroid hormone receptors we are currently aware of. TR beta 1 was been cloned by Ron Evans of the Salt Institute, and the one on the bottom was similar to TR alpha 1, which was cloned initially in chickens by Bjorn Benstrom, but had a distinct carboxyl terminus, as you can see on the slide. We called this molecule CRBA alpha 2, since TR alpha was the cellular homologue of an oncogene called ERBA, now, of course, known as TR alpha 2. As we were getting ready to publish this new thyroid receptor, the only thing remaining to show was that it actually bound thyroid hormone. This should have been quite straightforward because thyroid hormone contains iodine molecules that can be radiolabeled to high specific activity, a key component of ligand binding assays. But unlike the other thyroid receptors that I and others could easily demonstrate to bind radiolabeled thyroid hormone, we couldn't detect binding of this thing called alpha 2. And you can see that in this slide. You can see the black bar, high binding of alpha in the first set of bars and of beta in the third set of bars, but alpha 2 in the middle looked just like control. So we couldn't really publish this because we didn't really know it was a thyroid receptor. And while I was optimizing and repeating this thyroid hormone binding experiment over and over again, paper came out in Science magazine describing a new form of TR alpha, which was clearly the same as the one that I had discovered. The results were remarkably similar to mine, with the one difference being that this TR alpha 2 was reported to bind thyroid hormone. So I went back and I tried again and again. But no matter how many times I performed this assay, I found no evidence that it could bind thyroid hormone, even though the positive controls using other receptors worked just fine. In the meantime, a paper came out in PNAS shown at the bottom here from a totally different group that also cloned the TR alpha 2 and claimed it was a bona fide receptor. So two different groups working presumably independently found the same thing. So it has to be true, right? Well, I'm going to argue that the binding of thyroid hormone was like a nice new set of clothes for TR alpha 2. Although I tried as hard as I could to repeat this, I had confidence in my own data. We published a paper in Molecular Endocrinology saying it doesn't bind thyroid hormone. And shortly around that time, a paper came out from Seigo Izumo and Vijay Badavi at Harvard that corroborated our findings. So I began to believe that maybe the emperor really had no clothes. But unlike the little boy whose shouts immediately made people realize the truth, the perceived impact of negative scientific results are much less than positive ones, and the impact is much less. We described our cloning of TR alpha 2 and its ability to bind thyroid hormone, as I mentioned, but what were we going to do? Who to believe? It was a scientific tug of war. TR alpha 2 binds thyroid hormone or it doesn't. How could it be resolved? Well, here I teamed up with Ron Koenig and Greg Brent and David Ware, who was at Harvard at the time. Now he's what your neighbor is, the chairman of nutrition department at Berkeley. And they had an assay for TR action up and running in which they could see the activity shown in the black bars on the right. And we reasoned that if it didn't bind thyroid hormone, it could act as a dominant negative. And sure enough, as you can see on the right, this was the case. TR alpha 2 was in a functional tug of war with TR alpha 1. And the transcriptional outcome was determined by the ratio of TR alpha 1 to TR alpha 2, or you could say alpha 2 to alpha 1. The demonstration of this molecular tug of war apparently had an impact on the field because no additional papers have come out since then claiming that TR alpha 2 can bind thyroid hormone. And I think it's, as much as it can be, a solved issue. To this day, I still don't know how two sets of investigators erroneously found that TR alpha 2 binds thyroid hormone, but I believe the problem has to do with the blurring of the importance of facts as the currency of science, which sets science apart from the humanities, and one of the reasons that I went to MIT and many of us went into science in the first place. As the case I presented, now I could say from the last century, illustrated the erosion of confidence in facts has been going on for some time, but there's a sense it's worse than ever for a variety of reasons that I'd now like to discuss as the topic of this lecture. Among his many honors and awards, Walter is a member of the AAP, which is an honorary society for physicians. Many in the audience know that the AAP is one of North America's oldest and most prestigious organizations honoring physicians, scientists, founded by 7 leading academicians of the era, including William Osler, who I'll talk about a little bit later. Does anyone here know how long the AAP has been around? If you don't know the answer off the top of your heads, as good multitaskers, especially those of you in Zoom land, you can try to find the answer as I continue this talk. Maybe try social media. However, crowdsourcing is notoriously unreliable. For example, an analysis of Twitter content in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing found that 29% of the most viral content on Twitter were rumors and fake news, and 51% were mainly opinions and comments. Only 20% of the information was true. You could also ask AI. So I asked ChatGPT when the AAP was founded, and it told me 1930, along with a lot of other interesting information, except, as this audience will appreciate, it was the wrong AAP. It was the American Academy of Pediatrics. So I said, okay, that's the wrong AAP. What other associations are called AAP? So it came up with all of these, including the Association of American Publishers, the Asian Academy of Preventive Dentistry, and a few others, including the American Association of Physicists, which is close, but still not the AAP that we're talking about here. I finally gave it the right answer. In this scenario, it came up with at least some useful information that you can see on the slide. So it's a fact that the Association of American Physicians is the AAP, just one of AAPs, and yet the AAP is not necessarily, for that reason, the Association of American Physicians. What is a fact? According to Webster's dictionary, a fact is a thing that is known or proved to be true. My point here, and I'll say this in a few different ways, is that facts matter, but it's getting harder and harder to be certain of what's an actual fact. For example, what's the capital of Pennsylvania? Correct, that's a fact. Well, this is out of order. Oh, darn. I think my animations are, okay, well, luckily Dr. Leslie had the punchline, but what you should have seen here is that only about 65% of people know that Harrisburg's the capital. Okay, this is, and you can see here that it was interesting to me that more people know that Sacramento is the capital of California than know that Boston is the capital of Massachusetts. Here's another example. I heard someone in my field being interviewed about leadership and confidently proclaiming that leadership is a verb, not a noun. It seems like this advice, this adage was coined by motivational speaker John C. Oh, man. I should have used my own slide. Something is wrong with the deck that you guys have here. Darn it. All right. Well, John C. Maxwell, and you see his picture here had come up. It's caught on, again, other slides that I had here, including a pseudo definition. Okay, I'm going to go on from that. In recent years, the sanctity of facts has reached crisis proportions as some of our nation's most trusted reporters of facts, such as the Washington Post and New York Times, are being labeled as fake news, especially by certain groups. In turn, many of these groups tweet and publish their own fake news. As I mentioned, you can't even trust AI, and actually researchers at the University of Southern California found bias in 38% of the so-called facts used by AI. This is not a new problem. John Adams, a famous Bostonian who was the third president of the United States, was particularly unhappy with the newspaper that was called the Philadelphia Aurora and proclaimed that, quote, there have been more new errors propagated by the press in the last 2 years than in the 100 years before 1798. In the 19th century, the proponents of fake news included Joseph Pulitzer, whose name graces the Pulitzer Prize that is given for journalistic excellence. Yet in 1864, his newspaper, the New York World, was shut down for 3 days after it published forged documents that were claimed to have been written by Abraham Lincoln. Most of the fake news that we hear about pertains to political and social issues, and there's much more of that now than ever. But there's plenty of fake information about biomedical science out there too. Among other things, this has led to unfounded fear of vaccines that has now reached crisis proportions. Disturbingly, there's also fake news from biomedical scientists. In the spring of 2020, when the US government was hyping hydroxychloroquine for patients with COVID-19 infections, despite the fact that this treatment was not proven to work, in a prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, which published a paper showing that the treatment was associated with arrhythmias and didn't work, providing a major argument against the use of hydroxychloroquine. However, within weeks of its publication, the scientific community raised questions about this study. And after additional scrutiny, The Lancet actually retracted this paper, even though in some ways the message was correct. It's been suggested that this is an excellent example of science policing itself. However, it's naive to believe that retraction of a high-profile publication is equivalent to having never published the paper in the first place. Papers do not disappear after retraction. A study by Candy Pedrera and colleagues actually found an increase in post-retraction citations compared with citations received pre-retraction. Moreover, the initial finding is often featured on page 1 of the newspaper, touted on the evening news, tweeted by the publisher, as well as the investigators and our institutions. This leads to worldwide dissemination of the false finding, whereas the eventual retraction usually receives much less attention. The collateral damage to the reputation of scientific research is enormous. The news media and the public have a large appetite for information relating to health, and they rely on the peer review system of the scientific community for accuracy in their reporting. If confidence in reputable peer-reviewed scientific publications is eroded, the public at large will lose their trust in science above and beyond the anti-science fringe elements and conspiracy theorists. I think we're already seeing that. We must not allow this to happen. Indeed, overall confidence in science is on the decline. And this article from Science Magazine a few years ago reported that only about 57% of Americans believe that science is good for society, down for 73% from the prior to the pandemic. The number of published peer-reviewed papers that are retracted is increasing at an exponential rate, as you can see here. But on top of this, thousands of additional papers appear online as preprints without any peer review, creating pressure on our most admired and impactful journals to compete for these papers at the task of reducing their standards of scientific rigor. So what can we do? I will now discuss 4 principles that I suggest we should remember in our roles as teachers, authors, scientists, and reviewers. I'll refer to these as bigger is better, the 3 little pigs, Bayes watch, and the emperor's new clothes. Also, look out for bullshit. Let me explain. Much of the scientific research community has settled on a statistical standard that in most cases accepts a change that has less than a 5% probability of occurring at random as being, quote, significant, unquote. However, the danger in describing changes only in terms of their statistical significance is that the magnitude of the change needs to be considered as well. As an example, let's use 2 situations that pediatric endocrinologists will appreciate in which changes in blood sugar are statistically significant. A tripling or quadrupling of blood sugar levels would be of major clinical concern. It's almost certainly into the diabetic range. On the other hand, a change of less than 1 millimole per liter, or about 15 to 20 milligrams per deciliter, would not be immediately worrisome and is of much less long-term consequence. Put another way, it is of statistical significance, but much less biological significance. Yet in the title and abstract of the peer-reviewed paper, both of these situations that are shown on the slide could be considered elevated blood glucose, conjuring up thoughts of diabetes. Of course, it would be ideal if everyone read all the papers carefully, but this is increasingly difficult with the sheer volume of journals, let alone preprints. It's further confounded as bioinformatic approaches, including natural language processing, are used to interrogate a large body of literature, including by AI, increasing the likelihood that effects of vastly different magnitude would be lumped together as causes of increased blood sugar. For example, in a review article. Furthermore, given the importance of diabetes, press offices in the popular press are likely to report on the new cause of increased blood sugar without considering the magnitude of the effect, leading to undue alarm in the case of small, albeit statistically significant, changes in blood sugar. Peer reviewers should make an assessment of biological significance in their area of expertise and consider that strongly when they formulate their recommendation. And editors should consider this in their decisions. The 3 little pigs. In 2017, Nobel laureate Bill Kalin exhorted science to publish houses of brick, not mansions of straw. This is a great paper, and I recommend it to everyone here, especially the trainees. It's clearly an allusion to the fable of the 3 little pigs. By the way, many people think that Hans Christian Andersen, who I'll get back to, wrote the 3 little pigs, but that's not true. Turns out, I won't make you guess, it was written by the English folklorist Joseph Jacobs, who included it in his book of English fairy tales, though in that book he gave credit to the person on the right who had written an earlier version of the story. Back to the 3 little pigs. You know the story. These 3 little pigs, one bad wolf, and they're trying to get away from the big bad wolf. One quickly builds a house of straw, but the wolf blows it down. Second builds a house of sticks, ditto. Equally inadequate. The third pig took the time to build a house of bricks, which resisted the wolf and stood the test of time. The third pig is a metaphor for what scientists should strive to be, publishing work that is reproducible and stands the test of time. Kalin pointed out that scientific work should be judged by, quote, whether its conclusions are likely to be correct, not whether it would be important if it were true. But this gets compromised more and more by editors and reviewers who demand that papers span diverse scientific disciplines that elevates the claims, and in the case of biomedical research, culminate in a final figure, often suggesting clinical relevance. Unfortunately, current trends seem to be in conflict with this prescription. This is largely because the most prestigious journals make publishing decisions based on whether or not the findings are novel. Novel means new and original, not like anything seen before. The more novel the work is, the more titillating it's likely to be, and that's when the science is noted by the lay press, which is what these journals aim for. But ironically, when used as a noun, the English word novel refers to a work of fiction, which is just the opposite of what a work of science is supposed to represent. Next, is more novelty always better than less novelty? This is my third point, and I call this Bayes watch. Not Baywatch. Actually, I'm referring to the Reverend Thomas Bayes, who said that the probability of a novel conclusion being correct is related to the weight of new evidence, tempered by the prior probability of it being true. This concept has been popularized in recent years by Nate Silva in his influential book, The Signal and the Noise. But I don't think that journals and reviewers take this into account as much as they should. We've all heard the expression, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. For sure, unexpected truths do emerge, but there needs to be weighty evidence before highly surprising conclusions become the prevailing scientific view. On the contrary, solid findings that advance the field may be considered too true to be good, which is the title of a comedy related to this point by George Bernard Shaw. Maybe he wrote this after one of his papers was rejected for lack of novelty. It does seem increasingly common that the most selective journals are willing to overlook scientific flaws if the conclusions of a paper will generate a buzz that resonates with the lay press and the general public. Yet the opposite, just the opposite, should be the case. Since current scientific thinking is based on a long record of many reproducible observations, the more incredible a new result is, the higher the standard of proof should be. I've heard some colleagues suggest that it's fine to allow really surprising findings to be published without appropriate levels of proof. They say, let the scientific community judge for itself, and we'll see whether the conclusions will hold up. I strongly disagree with this notion. This causes unnecessary distraction for the scientific community at large and major damage when the news media and public that trust science to be grounded in facts discover that they've been misled. Furthermore, once it's out there, it's difficult to put the genie back in the bottle and ignore the fact that the surprising result has been discredited. Indeed, on many occasions, I've had trainees excitedly tell me about a paper they came across in the literature that makes an incredible point, without simultaneously finding the trail of publications refuting that work. Indeed, the word incredible is derived from the Latin word meaning not worthy of belief. So you should maintain a good deal of skepticism and probably not use the word incredible about your findings. The late Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning author of Thinking Fast and Slow, said in his later years that, quote, 12 years ago, my default was to believe anything that was surprising. Now when I see a surprising finding, my default is not to believe it, unquote. We should always be wary of colleagues who describe their finding as incredible or unbelievable. Again, unbelievable means you shouldn't believe it. As a rule, these are not good things in science. The goal of science is to make discoveries that are reproducible and therefore believable. Okay, the emperor's new clothes, or look out for bullshit. Science is the search for truth about the natural world. It's hubris to think that we know the truth, but it's critical that as science builds its house of bricks that I just talked about, it does so based on reproducible observations. The interpretation of these observations leads to hypotheses that are tested by experimental scientists. The results of these experiments lead to revised hypotheses, and the more surprising the result, the more hypothesis needs to be revised. While truth is the goal, falsehood is the poison to this operation. When it occurs, it slows the progress of science and erodes confidence in the scientific enterprise. Science does police itself, as I mentioned earlier, in the form of paper retractions, and these mainly occur following overt scientific misconduct, where the scientist intentionally dupes colleagues and reviewers to make false claims. This form of scientific fraud is hardly new. It has been highlighted many times by others. Scientific misconduct is likely motivated by ambition, as well as in some cases, a conviction by the scientist that they know what the result should be, even if it can't be demonstrated by controlled experiments. In any case, scientific misconduct is a form of lying. The perpetrators know they're reporting false data, and the explanation for its non-reproducibility is clear. Now, despite the increased number of retracted papers, many more published papers are non-reproducible that can be explained by intentional misconduct. For example, researchers at pharmaceutical companies, including Ware, could replicate less than 1/3 of published findings that they pursued in their own laboratories. The cause of this depressing failure to reproduce academic-derived published results is probably multifactorial. In many cases, it's likely that the non-reproducibility results from subtle but important variations in protocols and approaches used by different investigators at multiple sites, maybe at different times of day. Another contributor to non-reproducibility may be unconscious bias on the part of the scientist toward proving their hypothesis, which can result in selective use and misinterpretation of data. This is more insidious than volitional misconduct because the scientists in this case don't believe that they're reporting false data, and the explanation for the non-reproducibility is often murky and in many cases is never definitively established. This phenomenon of scientists seeing what they want to see was paralleled in 1837 by the great Danish author Hans Christian Andersen in the literary folktale The Emperor's New Clothes, which inspired the talk of this lecture. The emperor saw clothes that didn't exist because he wanted to see them. Returning to the case I presented at the beginning of the lecture, although it's not clear how two sets of investigators erroneously found that TRα2 binds thyroid hormone, one possibility is that there was an unconscious bias because they were cloning a thyroid receptor, and of course it had to bind thyroid hormone. Believing that they knew this to be true and that the goal was to prove this as a fact rather than test the hypothesis may have been somehow how we ended up with that result. Nobel laureate Bob Lefkowitz has pointed out this cause of non-reproducibility, and in a beautiful lecture that's published here, he referred to this as a form of bullshit. Yes, in this article in the JCI, it actually uses the word bullshit. It pays homage, actually, to Professor Harry Frankfurt's illuminating and aptly titled book on bullshit, which is about 100 pages long and an easy read, and I recommend this. It's a terrific book. Frankfurt suggested that the difference between a lie and bullshit is that while the liar or perpetrator of scientific misconduct knows they're lying, the bullshitter doesn't. Because lies can be recognized as such, he actually postulated that bullshit is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. Similarly, results that are non-reproducible for unknown reasons tend to rear their ugly heads and linger in a more sinister manner than data proven to be falsified and retracted. Clearly, as illustrated by the case I presented, these are not new issues, but they're on the rise and a more palpable threat to biomedical science enterprise because of the proliferation of journals and preprint servers, as well as both conventional and social media, hyping the most surprising new findings. We can't rely on every paper being read carefully by everyone potentially interested in the findings, so the onus is increasingly on the front end. That is, the release of new scientific facts into the scientific world. At a time when facts are being challenged, it is more important than ever for science and scientists to be seen as an unbiased and reliable source of valid information about the natural world. One step toward the solution is to align career success with reproducibility. Current metrics for success in obtaining grants, academic promotions, and scientific honors lean towards rewarding novelty and perceived impact. These are important, but the system is becoming unbalanced, and we need to be equally rewarding reproducibility. This can be a metric that's empirically assessed by documenting subsequent papers that directly reproduce the original findings. Even more credit should be given when later work adds one or more bricks to the solid house of scientific progress. A shining example is the basic science done by my Penn colleague, colleagues, Catalin Carrico and Drew Weissman, whose 2023 Nobel Prize Physiology and Medicine is based on a nearly 20-year-old prior paper shown below their discovery of RNA modifications that prevent immunogenicity, which was barely noticed when it was published, but paved the way to the RNA vaccines that led us out of the COVID-19 crisis. Scientific knowledge itself is a public good that must be based not on science fiction, but on science facts. And as scientists strive to maintain our authority and influence progress in this world, skepticism is a good thing. And here I'd like to pay tribute to the late Harriet Hall, who was also known as the Skepdoc, and a founder of a journal called Science-Based Medicine, who sadly passed away recently. Sir William Osler, who I mentioned earlier as one of the founders of the AAP, was also a famous skeptic. From 1884 to 1889, Osler was a professor at Penn, where he was highly skeptical of the medicines available at the turn of the 20th century, because he knew that most of them did no good and many of them did harm. He said that, quote, one of the first duties of the physician is to educate the masses not to take medicine. And he saved many lives by taking patients off the quack medicines that were popular in his time. Osler said that the practice of medicine is an art based on science, and he left Penn to found Johns Hopkins Medical School with this intent. Now, Osler, being a skeptic, this was not always beyond dispute. For one thing, he was quite skeptical about, and it hurts me to say this, productivity after the age 60. As he was leaving Johns Hopkins to become the Regius Professor at Oxford, he gave a speech in which he referred to a dystopian novel by Anthony Trollope, which was called The Fixed Period. In this book, Trollope imagined a scenario where men faced mandatory retirement at 67, followed by committing suicide. But Osler actually, in his speech, had his facts wrong and said that the plot of the book hinges on a society in which men at 60 retired for a year of contemplation before a peaceful departure by chloroform. Even in those pre-Twitter days over 100 years ago, the comment of Osler about chloroform went viral. His speech was covered by the popular press, leading to newspaper headlines such as, Osler recommends chloroform at 60. And even though he didn't actually make this recommendation, for a while, the term to Oslerize became a synonym for euthanasia. Osler was actually blindsided by the bad publicity. One US newspaper decried that humanity has been forced to undergo well-intentioned attempts at wit that were woefully miscarried. Countering this, the Montreal Gazette, and Osler was from Montreal, wrote that Americans may not know that with all their ability to see a joke, they're world famous for not being able to take a joke. As I mentioned, Osler was not American and rather had a Canadian, and his original academic success began at McGill University before he came to Penn. Back to the need for skepticism. Skepticism is a rigorous but open-minded way of thinking about things. Many scientists are skeptical, and opportunities for skepticism are increasing, as it seems that hardly a day goes by before we hear about a new cure for cancer, new cure for diabetes, new cure for Alzheimer's, and other diseases, not to mention new treatments that could extend lifespan to the age of 150, which is particularly popular in Northern California, as I know. In most cases, these reports are highly preliminary and unproven, which is why skepticism is in order. Osler said that one special advantage of the skeptical attitude of mind is that one is never vexed to find that, after all, he has been in the wrong. In other words, if most new ideas that go against dogma and previous work are wrong, and if I, as a skeptic, always predict that they're wrong, I will be right most of the time. And let's face it, as Larry David might say, that feels pretty good. It's also important for scientists to be skeptical because it would be a very bad thing if the public equated scientists with the boy who cried wolf. So often that no one believed him, even when he was right. This slide, this meaningful fable dates back from Aesop's times, again, not Hans Christian Andersen. It would be a disaster if the public loses faith in science and scientists, But that is already happening in the form of what's known as science denial. And as we know, an increasingly large swath of the public deny the truth of a number of solid science advances, including evolution, climate change, and vaccines, of course. Now, at the same time, many of you probably see a paradox, which is that if I, as a skeptic, predict that every new finding that sounds unbelievable or amazing is wrong, well, yes, I'll be right the vast majority of the time, but it could be argued that I too am practicing a form of science denial. If I deny everything then I would refuse to accept impactful discoveries such as semiconductors, the ability to ward off heart attacks by lowering cholesterol levels, and the ability to cure genetic diseases using CRISPR pathways discovered in microorganisms. And it would be wrong to be skeptical about vaccines as a safe and effective means of preventing epidemics of infectious disease that can rip through a population, because there's data for that. So I have to emphasize that the skepticism I'm talking about and science denial are not the same thing. If the empirical evidence for something novel or surprising is strong and reproducible, then we must believe it, even if we don't like it or we didn't predict it ourselves. We just need to remain skeptical of claims that are not proven or not reproducible or go against the laws of nature. I'm frankly amazed how often these standards are lost as our academic institutions look to promote themselves and the growing media of all kinds vie for the attention of a key lay public that's bombarded by an overwhelming number of choices of what to read, watch, or tweet. So many of these stories are flashes in the pan or unproven or simply untrue. Andy Warhol said that everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes, and maybe that's what this is about. By the way, Warhol almost certainly did not actually say that. It turns out that Pontus Hultén, a Swedish art collector and museum curator, was writing the notes for a Warhol exhibit at the Stockholm Modern Art Museum in 1968, and he inserted the quote because he reasoned, his words, even if Warhol didn't say it, he very well could have said it. So let's put it in. It's a great story, and even the skeptic in me believes that one would be true. I'd like to end with some skepticism about diets. I think most people accept that eating too much leads to gaining weight. Calories consumed minus calories burned. But there's no agreement on exactly what we should eat. For many years, the prescription was to eat a low-fat diet. A low-fat diet is by necessity a high-carb diet. But nowadays, there's been a shift in popular thinking towards a low-carb diet. First, there was the Atkins diet. Now there are variants, including the keto diet, the cyclic keto diet, the paleo diet, and the low-carb Mediterranean diet. Probably some of the people listening to this talk have tried them or know people who have. I know I have. Now, there's some science behind all of these diets, but none is completely convincing except to the true believers. That does include physicians, scientists, journalists, and basically a large segment of the population. The diets can be justified by impressive sounding theories, and some of the people in the room definitely have to forgive me. I'm sorry, but terms like the carbohydrate insulin model and the energy balance model. More recently, based upon scientific links between circadian clocks and metabolism, newer diets call for intermittent fasting. By the way, these are all books you can buy on Amazon online. There's plenty more where these came from. This is just a subset. But even these don't agree on when you should eat. Is it alternate day? Is it only in the daylight? Some are specifically tailored for women. Yet the safety of these diets has recently been called into question. In my day job, I do research in this area. Talk a little bit about tomorrow with what some of you are probably thinking real science in my lecture, if anybody comes to that. I direct an institute at Penn that is focused on diabetes, obesity, and metabolism. I study circadian rhythms and metabolism in my lab, so I should have an informed opinion about what we should eat and what time we should eat it. This comes up all the time at cocktail parties. So many people are concerned about their weight. And when they find out what I work on, they want me to tell them exactly what they should eat and when they should eat it because I'm an expert. They want me to tell them with certainty that they should be eating a low-carb diet or high-carb or at certain times of day. Some of my colleagues confidently tell them exactly when or what they should eat, and people love it. They're the ones that the people are congregating around. I almost said the people eat it up. They don't want a wishy-washy answer. And I'm sorry to disappoint them. But I can't tell them exactly what they should be eating because I just don't know. The scientific data are not compelling, and I'm skeptical of those who overconfidently invoke a pseudoscientific rationale to instruct people on exactly when and what they should eat. I don't think I'm a cynic or a pessimist or a nihilist because I actually do believe that someday we'll figure much of this out. That will require more science. And my own guess is that because people are genetically different, there'll be some diets that work better for one person than the other, and vice versa. But until I could recommend a more specific diet for everyone, I can only recommend reducing calories. And when it comes to high fat versus low fat, try both kinds of diets and figure out which is best for you. Be a skeptic of things that sound too good to be true, and let it be known that the emperor has no clothes if you cannot see them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lazar. That was a very sort of thought-provoking talk, and I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. And thank you very much. We're now open for questions. Rob.
Mitch, really enjoyed it and couldn't agree more. However, being the skeptic that I am, I'm going to present the other side for just a minute. And you may have heard this back in 1911. Niels Bohr famously said, "Science advances one funeral at a time," which is exactly the opposite of where you took this just now. So the question, of course, is that true? And you may be aware of this because it was done at MIT. Pierre Azoulay is the first author. It was published in the National Bureau of Economic Research in 2012. But for the audience who doesn't know about it, what they did was they asked that question: does science advance one funeral at a time? So what they did was they took the entire roster of the NAS and the IOM and looked at all the gurus and looked at their paper productivity and their co-authors over a 20-year span. Now, in that 20 years, some of the gurus would have died. And the question was not what happened to the guru, he died or she died, but what happened to the co-authors. And what they showed was that the co-authors, their paper productivity fell off a cliff as soon as the guru died. And then they asked the question, all right, who's publishing in that same venue? So they use mesh terms on all of these papers to determine who the new authors in this area were, and there's a completely new set of people. So they basically showed, indeed, science advances one funeral at a time because the guru was holding the entire field hostage. So the question for you is, how do you reconcile the question of skepticism versus the question of, shall we say, provincialism within science?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. That's a beautiful paper and or interesting, I should say, at least. I guess I would say it's all about the facts. And I don't know why those people plummeted. We can think of reasons. For example, often we all know of cases where such and such a principal investigator can get papers published in Cell Science and Nature easier than others, it seems. And maybe their progeny are not so fortunate. I don't know. I mean, one would have to look under the hood at that. But I personally think it's because of the science. And if the stuff that they originally published didn't hold up, they're not going to be able to build on, and they won't be quoted, and they won't be productive. And then someone else will come along. And in many of the cases, they are building just in a either orthogonal or not directly on top. And that is how science proceeds. It's a crooked path. So I have a slightly different interpretation of the data in that paper, but I think it's a great thing to bring up. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Great talk. Very interesting. And I think you talk a lot about the motivations from the publishers about maybe rushing to publish or publishing data or putting it out there for the society to look at before it's really ready or before of a lower caliber, let's just say. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the other pressures, for instance, that are on the scientists to publish or perish, and especially in academic medicine. I'm in our clinical line, so I don't have that pressure, but I see others that live with that pressure. And so how do you balance that by saying, we want you to spend time to develop really strong science, but if you don't publish this many within this period of time, you cannot advance in your career?
Great question. I don't have the answer. I tried to allude to one direction toward the answer. I think the direction toward the answer would be to reward things that have stood the test of time, even if it's in the time frame of promotion. A couple of other, and I personally would love to see my own institution and others, even when I review your tenure packers here at UCSF, I'd like to see a section that says these findings have been reproduced by the following other people. And if anyone knows who those are, it's always the person who's being evaluated. And just like they submit something about their accomplishments, why not include the things that they've done that other people have either replicated or built upon? And what I like about that partial solution, because it's not the full solution, is that it's a carrot, not a stick. You know, some of the suggestions, and I didn't mention them, I could have, would be to, I'm not against putting repeat offenders in the penalty box for a long time, or journals or whatever. But if we can find a carrot, it's always better than a stick. The other thing that many institutions are doing is asking for the top 5 papers and an explanation for why that makes the person worthy of tenure rather than 150 publications. But even that's very department specific. And someone I know, obviously mentioning names, is in a department where they seem to only value the number of publications, even, or maybe not recognizing it. There's so many of these ridiculous journals that are, now in PubMed, that it's not that hard to publish in journals if you don't really care about how well they're being reviewed. So again, not the answer, but it's my opinion about the direction to the answer. It's a really important question.
Thanks. Dr. Lazar, if I could add to that, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the current peer review process and how that could potentially shift going forward. It seems like the peer review process as it is right now feels very strained from both directions. It feels like it's increasingly hard to publish your work in good journals unless there are, like you said, unbelievable or novel findings. And on the other end, it seems like editors and reviewers are like really overstrained and not enough reviewers good reviewers with content knowledge or background to review papers. And so it just feels like it's like at both ends, it's really challenging. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the current process and how you think it could be better.
Yeah, another fantastic question. And I do have thoughts about it. They might be a little bit idealistic, but one of the problems that comes up in relation to your question is, because of this desire to be spectacular, you'll see papers all the time that have A causes B, causes C, causes D, causes C. They'll often refer to it as an axis. And if you want to review that paper correctly, every step, A to B, B to C, C to D, each one has to be carefully controlled. And that control data needs to be in things like the supplementary material. And so you'll hear many of my colleagues, maybe many people in the room, saying, I can't believe how much supplementary material they asked for. It's ridiculous. Well, it's only ridiculous because you're putting a paper together that has 10 steps, and they're often in series. And you don't have to be a mathematician to know that if you have 10 steps in series, and each one has a 0.9 chance of being right, 0.9 to the 10th power is a very small probability it's going to be true. So I have a huge skepticism about those papers, and I wouldn't allow those papers. I would stick to the limit on figures and the limit on supplementary figures, but not by letting them show less stuff that supports their A to B to C to D, but just show A to B or A to B to C really convincingly. That's what Bill Kalin's article is about. And so again, I really recommend people read that. Will it happen? That's the idealistic part. It's saying quality and something you can, take to the bank is worth something and ought to be highlighted. Just this is great science. It's sometimes harder nowadays. Again, the gray hairs know there used to be times where you'd get a piece of data. I was talking with Maya earlier about, exciting data. It used to be it would come out of a film developer or a scintillation counter. You'd see right away, aha, there's the result. But now with big data, which is super important, and we're not going to put that genie in the bottle by any means, but oftentimes it's so processed, there is no real aha moment. And it's hard to even say who made the discovery. And I think that adds to the problem. I have less of a solution for that one.
Thank you. Oh, there's a question online that I can read out from Sunil Kolwad, who asks, journals like JBC, JLR, AJP, and others were famously places where row after row of good solid brick houses could be built and stand the test of time. Maybe small stores, but solid ones, great experiments that people could repeat and from which trainees could learn. But the impact factors of journals like these have fallen tremendously in recent times, and people don't want to submit there anymore. Any thoughts on this trend and why the issues you raise are so prevalent in scientific publishing today? What can we do about this?
Yeah, thanks, Sunil. I mean, I hate the impact factor. I think it's been a real detriment to our work exactly for that reason. Trainees don't want to publish in certain journals, and the proliferation of journals that have Science, Cell, and Nature in their name has been been really bad for some of the journals that Sunil mentioned there. I do think, and I wasn't sure where you're going with the question, but I will say that I do favor the model of the journals in which scientists are the editors. PNAS, JCI, endocrine journals. There's many of these journals. The ones with professional editors, and I review for them, and I'm on boards of some, and so on. I mean, I just worry about the degree of skepticism that they're showing. Not that our own peers as scientists will, but I think it's better. So everything else being equal, I think those are journals to aim for. But you're right, trainees don't want to publish there, especially once the impact factor is single digits, and it's unfortunate.
Thank you.
I think Walt had a question.
Oh, sure.
I was just thinking about the science advances one funeral at a time. And I think the original quote, and see if you can tell me who wrote this. Quote, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is not familiar with it.
Thomas Kuhn?
Max Planck.
Okay, good.
And I think with that, we'll conclude. We're at the end of the hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Lazar, for that incredible talk. And thanks to the audience for your great participation.